So first, thank you for coming. I kind of feel like I'm teaching 7th grade all over again. Everybody like right in the back there. I kind of want this to be a conversation about the work that I'm doing and the work that you're doing and the ways that those two bodies of work might be able to inform each other. So the fact that you don't even understand my title is kind of an interesting starting place. But I hope that within the next hour you will understand the title, and furthermore you'll have a sense of my purpose in building a joint research program in the fields of neuroscience and education. That is very specifically what I'm interested in doing, and I hope that you see why. And in particular, I'm very happy to have the opportunity to collaborate with you here at USC, at Rossier School in particular, because of the focus on urban education. Many of the discoveries that we're making in affective and social neuroscience, I feel would have very profound implications for how we understand and interpret sort of constrained theories of social interaction in urban settings, especially in development. But that is really up to a collaborative effort between us to be able to solve those kinds of problems. I have the sense that they're very relevant and very important, and I would really like to know what you think about them and what work you feel is relevant and how we might be able to collaborate. That said, I also just want to lay out there that I'm here as a collaborative researcher. I'm here looking for a position, a joint position between neuroscience and education, because I'm interested in bringing those two fields together. I'm not interested right now in upending the entire enterprise of urban education as it's currently conceived and changing it into a new kind of interdisciplinary mind-brain education program. That's an interesting thing, and I've actually had several offers from other universities who want me to start such a program. I'm not interested in doing that. What I'm really interested in doing is building a collaboration right now. I feel like those programs are getting ahead of themselves. What I want to do is build a collaboration in which educational expertise and neuroscientific research can come together to mutually inform one another. Because in the end, if the principles and the findings that you're discovering in urban educational settings are correct, if they're true, if they're useful, they have to be biologically plausible. These are people that you're discovering things about, right? And there are people living in bodies with brains, okay? And there's interactions between their bodies and their brains. These bodies and brains, these people are interacting in social contexts. They're interacting with each other. They're living in an urban environment that influences the way they think and feel, that influences the status of their body and of their mind, right? So the things that you're discovering have to be biologically plausible. So I'm hoping that by presenting some of our new evidence today, you get a sense of the ways that neurobiological research can constrain the possibilities in qualitative and quantitative research in urban educational settings. Okay, at the same time, if what I'm discovering does not seem right to you, if it contradicts what you know is true about development, what you see on a day-to-day basis in kids, then I'm on the wrong track, right? I can't be right if I'm not describing real behavior in real social contexts. Okay? If there's something fundamentally contradictory, then you need to tell me, because I'm on the wrong track and we need to fix it. And it's in this tension between the two disciplines that I think real progress can be made. Progress that really helps us to reconceptualize what it means to be a social person in an urban setting, or in any other kind of educational setting for that matter. All right. So as we proceed, I really want you to treat this as a conversation, and for us to discuss what I'm putting out there. I'm going to try to lay out my theoretical predispositions for you, my training, my approach, and then I want us to debate and discuss that approach in relation to the work that you're doing. That's really the purpose. So I'm going to start with a warning. Okay? This talk is dark and scary. Right? Why is it dark and scary? It's dark and scary because I'm talking about issues that are very dear to our most human sentiments. I'm talking about issues of consciousness, issues of self, the way that we build identity for ourselves, the role of the body and of the mind in creating identities and in organizing our social interaction and our learning. Right? These things are sort of brushed aside typically in especially policy level discussions in governments in particular, not here I know, but in policy level discussions about educational decisions for kids, right? We tend to spend way too much time trying to focus on the cognitive skills, drill the skills that they're weak at so that they can graduate with a certain proficiency in reading and math, okay? And of course we need our students to have proficiency in those kinds of skills. Of course we do. I'm not at all suggesting that we shouldn't be teaching them or drilling them in these things. But the focus has really been skewed towards the sort of traditional cognitive skills and away from the effect that drilling and overemphasis on sort of decontextualized rote skills will have on students' social selves, their formation of identity, their choice to admire and to emulate peer groups, for instance, right? Their choice to align themselves and try to emulate their teachers as opposed to their peers on the streets. Okay? So I'm hoping that I'll show you through this neurobiological evidence. This is very new evidence. It's just under review right now. I'm not technically supposed to be talking about it because we've submitted it to a journal.
We won't tell everybody.
Yeah, but it's going to be just our secret. Okay? All right. Yeah, it's fine. I think those kind of rules are completely ridiculous. All right, if you go out and scoop my story by next week, I'll be extraordinarily impressed. All right. Yeah, so that's what I wanted to start with. Now, first let me just say, I gave a little talk to the recruitment or the master's programs. How many of you have seen that posted on YouTube? How many people have actually watched that talk? Oh, okay. All right, so good. So in that case, I'm going to keep all the first few slides, and I'm going to take you through very quickly just some definitions from a neurobiological perspective of emotion and the role that the body plays in emotion so that you have a sense of the vocabulary as I'm using it. Okay, because this is one of the biggest divides between interdisciplinary endeavors is that we don't understand the words that each other are using. So I want to get across to you my concept of emotion because it's going to be probably slightly different than the sort of intuitive concept of emotion that you have as an educator. And we can debate that. So I picked very carefully a picture of my daughter's jack-o'-lantern from last year as sort of a metaphor for what I mean by emotion. Okay? Emotion in this scheme is a physiological state of the body and mind, okay? And it's sort of the warmth inside the body. Okay? It's a change in the efficiency, if you really want to get very mechanical about it, it's a change in the efficiency of the workings of the body. Okay? It's the shift from, it's a pattern of behaviors that shift things like blood flow from your muscles for running to your gut, okay, for example, for digestion, right? It's the, and it's the accompanying cognitive changes that go along with these changes in the physiology of the body. So, for example, in the jack-o'-lantern, what you see shining out through the face is sort of the warmth of the inside of the jack-o'-lantern. Okay? In a person, the emotion that you see, that you sense in them, comes out through their facial expressions, it comes out through their behaviors, it comes out through other measures of their psychophysiology, right? The way that they sweat, the way that their pulse races, the way that their blood pressure changes. All these kinds of physiological changes are indicators of an internal emotional state. And I should say that emotional state is sort of measurable. It's a physical change in the body and in the mind. So just to get across what I mean by a change in the mind, right? The state of your body changes the way you're predisposed to think about problems. So a good example of this I always find is myself. I love to pick on myself. Coming out of a movie and going back to my car, right? And I find myself, when I come out of a scary movie or a thriller, right, I'm just ever so much more likely to just glance in the back seat of my car and see if somebody is broken in there and is waiting for me, right? Now, there's no chance that some bad guy would have broken into the back of my car and is waiting for me after a Psycho movie than after, a chick flick, right? Why am I more inclined to look in the back seat of my car? I'm more inclined because my body is in a residual state of fear, even a vicariously induced one. I was in no danger in the movie theater, but I was sort of playing around with thoughts and perceptions that would vicariously induce this state of fear, and that state of fear changes my cognitive predisposition. It sets me to think in a particular way, and it makes me more likely to do behaviors that suit that kind of thinking, like looking in the backseat of my car. Right? Does that make intuitive sense? Make sense? Okay. if at any point this doesn't make sense, or you have a question, or you want to make a comment, or you disagree with me, please just interrupt. Yes? Oh, with a pointer. Yeah, that kind of interruption I love. All right, thank you. That's fine. Okay, so for now, this is use period then. Yeah. Okay, so next I'm going to show a picture of emotion in social context. This is a picture of some friends of mine. And if you look at it for a second, I find when I look, right, half the room goes, ah, right? Why do you do that? You do that because you automatically experience some aspects of these people's, and that dog's, physiology on your own self. Right? This is the fundamental process by which social interaction builds, on which it builds. Okay? We automatically feel, we automatically vicariously experience, and the neurological mechanisms for this are just being discovered. Okay, but I'm going to talk a little bit about them. But we automatically internalize the feelings of other people insofar as we understand those feelings, insofar as we have experienced those feelings ourselves, or we've experienced something close enough to them that we can imagine what it must be like. You don't have to actually have done everything here. But you know what it feels like to be with other people, to be snuggling in bed on a Sunday morning or something, to be with people you love. Okay? You know how that changes your physiological state and predisposes you to think in particular ways. Okay? And so you automatically empathize with that. And the other thing I want to point out in this picture is that I really like showing this picture because it shows us sort of the developmental range in how emotions are felt and expressed. Right? And we can even do a cross-species comparison here, okay? You can start with the dog, you move up through like the 2-year-old, and the 6-year-old, and the dad, and what you get is that the physiological states, okay, that are the emotion, the behaviors, the heart rate, the blood pressure, the look on their face, even on the dog's face to an extent, right? The postures that they're in that are very relaxed. Those states are shared across everybody, including the dog in the picture. Right? They all are in this social context that is conducive because of prior experience, because of their learning, because of, to a limited extent in the dog, but to a greater extent to the 2-year-old, the 6-year-old, and especially the father, the cultural knowledge that they have about the meaning of this context. That this physiology is induced in them. And so what we could say about this is that the emotional state of all of these people and the dog is very similar. What differs between these people gives us a sense of development. What differs between these people is what I would call feelings. The experience of these physiological states differs because of the knowledge that each of the agents in the picture brings to the understanding of their own body and mind. The cultural knowledge, the social knowledge, the intellectual knowledge that they've built up over a lifetime of living in a particular kind of social cultural context helps them to interpret that physiology in different ways. And because you're all educators, you know, I don't need to go into detail, that the dog, right, doesn't have a great deal of socio-cultural sophistication. It's not reflecting on this physiological state. It's merely sort of experiencing it. Okay? And it's triggered by its learned associations with these people. It knows what it feels like to be with these people, and it's in a relationship with these people. But increasingly, from the 2-year-old to the 6-year-old to the father, what you get is a further differentiation of a further advancement or complexifying of the knowledge about what this physiological state in their own body means to them. Right? So for the father, you know, this is all about his role as the starter of the family, as the person who's responsible for these children. He's nurturing their growth. He's proud of them. He loves them. For the 2-year-old, it's very different. Okay, it's a much more simple kind of a social interaction. So what I want you to take away from this picture is that there's a continuum of the experience of emotion, but emotions themselves are innate and biological. The ways that you trigger them, the context that you trigger them in, what you know about the result of particular physiological states and how you interpret those states, that develops. But the actual physiology, you don't have access to, unless there's some evidence now that with a lot of very specific kinds of practice, you can gain access to some physiology. for example, in highly trained and practiced expert Buddhist monks, right? That there's evidence that they can actually control their physiology directly, that they can slow their heartbeats and things like that. And that's an intense, under intense study right now because it's extremely interesting. It highlights the top-down connection as much as the bottom-up. And now I want you to just take a leap with me. Humor me as a biologist. I know, everybody's shaking. I have to tell you, I got a call from Kurt Fisher last night. He's a professor at Harvard. He was my doctoral dissertation advisor. And he called to ask what I was going to talk about today. And I said, well, I'm going to talk about this, and then I'm going to talk about the ant. He said, don't talk about the ant. I don't like the ant. It's very misleading to people. It makes them think that you think that people are just ants. And so I want to say that I trust you not to think that, and here's why, right? The reason I show the ant is not because I think that children and people can be reduced to the emotional level of ants. Absolutely not. But what ants exemplify very well is the fundamental nature of the interdependence between cognition and emotion, between thinking and emotion, right? And here's why. When you see an ant running in the sidewalk, have you ever stopped to wonder how come when you walk next to it, it stops going towards its nest, it turns, it runs into a little crack, and it hides there until you move on, and then it comes back out, right? Now, ants are not conscious of this change in behavior. I am not suggesting that the ant is sitting there reflecting upon the deep meaning of the fact that you walked by and it should hide in a crack, okay? But what is going on in the ant is some kind of biological and evolutionary precursor to what we have as complex social beings. And what that is it's got a package of behaviors, okay? And it's got a package of cognitive strategies. And those things, the cognitive strategies, act to be able to basically improve the status or the sort of comfort level of the ant's body and of the queen ultimately, right, of the ant species and the ants like. Why does it turn and run into a crack? It turns and runs into a crack at the most basic level because it has a little bioprogram built in that says when shadows approach from this kind of angle, find low place and hang out. Okay, but from the way that I want you to interpret the example is that it runs into the crack at the most basic fundamental level, even though it is not conscious of this. It runs into the crack to save its life. It runs into the crack to make itself not get smushed. Right? And then it comes back out and continues to the nest. It changes its cognitive set away from its original goal in order not to get smushed, in order to save itself, in order to stay comfortable with a healthy working body. And then it changes it back as the conditions change, and it continues on to its nest. Right? Both of those cognitive changes happen in the service of making the ant efficient and biologically happy and alive. And what I want you to understand by the end of this talk is that people bear the legacy of that relationship. Every thought that we think, everything that we do in order to solve an emotional goal at the most basic level. Why do we act in particular ways? We act in particular ways because they make us flourish in some sense. They make us accepted in our social environment. They make us happy, or they make us efficient in some sense. They make us they give us the thrill of having solved a problem, right? Why do students solve math problems, for example? I pick on math only because it's traditionally seen as sort of a cold cognitive domain, right? But I think any mathematician would disagree with that heartily, and well, they should, okay? Why did students sit there in 10th grade and solve math problems? The reasons range from it's really interesting and it's fun to find the solution, and when I get to it, I get this sort of jolt of pleasure from having discovered it, to I don't want my dad to kill me for failing my math test, right? Even notice the language that adolescent kids especially use belies this tie between sociocultural context and decision making and biological homeostasis, death, right? We don't mean she doesn't mean hopefully that her father is physically going to kill her when she doesn't pass her math test. What she means is that it's going to feel like a kind of sociocultural death if my father's not proud of me, right? And what I want you to take from this is that I want you to see that the reasons we think in particular ways, the reasons we do the things we do because they serve us in some kind of evaluative, subjective sense that we call emotion. Does that make sense? That all makes sense. So ants are not akin to people, and I don't suggest that your students are little ants. All right. So we move from ants to airplanes, and I've kind of alluded to this. When you see this airplane, you can very easily imagine yourself inside it, right? You know what it feels like to be sitting in the seat and hearing that engine noise and drinking your apple juice or whatever it is you get on airplanes, and waiting to land and getting uncomfortable in your straight seat there. Okay? You don't have to go try very hard to automatically engage in a simulation of what it would be like to be in that airplane, right? And then you automatically emotionally engage that simulation. It's not just a cognitive simulation. It's not just a sort of cold spatial positioning of yourself in an airplane. You're feeling yourself in that airplane, and you're thinking, God, I don't really like being in airplanes. I wish I were home. And you know what it feels like, what it's evaluatively like to be in an airplane, automatically. So the simulation is both cognitive and emotional simultaneously. You can't divorce those two things. Now if you imagine you're in this airplane, okay? Right? Everybody kind of goes, why? You have a physiological response of fear when you look at that airplane and imagine being in it. Automatically, because, once again, you can't help but simulate the experience of being in that airplane and how it would feel to you to be there emotionally, how that would be evaluated were you there. And that simulation automatically changes your cognitive set, and it predisposes you to think about other problems in particular ways, right? It's probably more likely that you're going to think about whether or not your kids are safe right now and whether or not you left the stove on than after you're imagining, the picture before with the family and the dog snuggling in bed. Okay? After the first picture, you're relaxing and you're just kind of feeling good, and you're thinking about how you love your family and stuff. After this picture, you're automatically thinking, did I leave the stove on? My God, am I supposed to be somewhere else right now? You get anxious just by virtue of the fact, and by virtue of the fact that you're experiencing a particular physiological state, also known as an emotion, that shifts the way you think. So the big point here is that the emotions that our bodies and minds engage in are accompanied by cognitive strategies that change the way we think. Now, if you imagine students in schools, any kind of school, urban or otherwise, a good school or a not so effective school, the ways that they feel and think are shaped by, quite literally, the physiological states of their bodies while they're there. That means, are they in danger? Are they in safe and comfortable surroundings? Have they eaten? Have they interacting with the material? Do they emulate and identify with the role models in the situation or with the kid sitting next to them? All of these things are going to shape the way they're predisposed to think. I'm going to give you a more specific example as we go on. So, going from simulations in airplanes to simulations in classrooms, I just want you to understand here that, and I picked on math again on purpose, okay, because some people would say that it's cold. How does a student solve a math problem like 2 times 2? How do you do that? Especially when you're just learning it, it's more, the strategies are more apparent, they're more open, they become more buried and automatic as you get very good at it. How do you do it? You do it by an interaction of cognitive and emotional processes. You do it by perceiving the problem first, then you have to say, well, what knowledge of mine, what skills of mine are relevant to this problem? And you have to steer your memory and your thinking into the sector of knowledge that's relevant for math problems, right? You have to say, how grandma feels today isn't relevant. Let me focus my attention on what I know about numbers and math, and then focus my attention further on the operation and what multiplication or addition is, and then at each level of further differentiation of moving your attention into the sector of knowledge that's going to help you with this problem, as you solve the problem, as you get closer, you get this subjective sense of sort of warmth, right? You're getting warmer, you're getting closer to the answer. Whether or not you like math, whether or not you want to be doing it, whether or not you're happy, it's not about students who are just in positive states all the time. You can be in a very negative state and be solving this for a reason that makes you extremely angry or very fearful. At the same time, you're going to get this, what I like to call jolt. One educator, when I was lecturing about this and running a workshop about this with a large school in the Boston area. One of the educators said, this is kind of like the jolt you get when you're solving something. And I really like that. I think they're going to call this jolt theory. Because what you get is this sort of sudden awareness that you've got this physiological reaction going on that's steering you to think, yeah, that's closer to the answer. Or, well, no, you're going the wrong way, this isn't right. And you all know as academics, right, as successful academics, you know that you've had enough experience with difficult problems that you get this subjective sense, like, don't talk to me, I'm getting warmer, I don't know what it is, but I'm on the sense that I'm on the track, right? And that's what I'm talking about. That is the emotional aspect of the emotional counterpart to the cognitive side of problem solving, even if the problem solving is in a domain that you would traditionally think of as rote and cognitive and academic. Clear? Yeah? So I want to just step back for a second and give you a little sense of how I'm thinking about development from a cognitive science perspective, because it's going to be relevant to the way that I interpret developmentally the data that we now have from the neurobiology in a few minutes. So my doctoral dissertation advisor was Kurt Fisher. I also worked with Catherine Snow and Howard Gardner and some other people on it. But my thinking about development is heavily influenced by neo-Piagetian theories such as skill theory of Kurt's. And in this scheme, you're probably all familiar with it, but cognitive development involves a building of connections, a relation building, a coordinating of skills. And those skills are cognitive and emotional ways of acting or thinking about the environment. Okay? And this is heavily reliant on people like Piaget, because you've got the idea of sort of you act on the environment, you get feedback about how your actions sort of went, and then you use that feedback, you incorporate that feedback to change your representations, your knowledge about the world, and to build new skills that will more effectively deal with the world. Okay? You're all familiar with this stuff. So I'll just give you a quick example. Do you need an example, or should we move on? Don't need an example, great. Okay, I just put it here just in case. When I'm working with teachers, obviously they need examples. I show a nice video of a baby trying to put cylinders into a block with her mother, and how she gets the mother to sort of design the context, support her in being able to do a skill she can't do, right? To build up the skills by sort of tilting the little cylinder she's trying to put them in so that it's just right, and the baby sort of squeals every time she needs the mother to drop it, and you get this nice cycle going between the baby and the mother that reveals how the baby's perception and her action are coming together to build a holistic skill for filling a cylinder with little blocks. So, like I said, you get this system of perception and action, and then it comes together to make a whole skill that can be united in its purpose or its goal. Now, the reason I'm laying this out for you, even though I know that you're familiar with these theories, is because this is the framework on which I want you to begin to think about the neurobiological findings that we have from the lab. Okay? And in doing so, I'm hoping that you can sort of engage with me in the kind of thinking that I do about affective and social neuroscience and its relation to education and learning. Because I'll tell you, the way that we're designing the studies on the surface, it's hard to see that. But it's in finding out basic functioning of the systems that support things like action and perception that we can get new insights into how this might look in educational contexts. And those insights in turn are testable in educational context and could have implications for the way that we design pedagogical interventions and assessments. And that's why I want to collaborate. So, just to sort of spill the beans, the fundamental units here are perception and action. I already said that. These two things converge in the brain to produce skills. We're just beginning to find out about that. So you've heard of mirror neurons, for example. Maybe or maybe not. It's been all over Scientific American and Time Magazine and everything else. Their role is vastly misunderstood and overstated. And those misunderstandings are somewhat fed by the investigators that are discovering them. But nonetheless, the basic understanding of mirror neurons is this. What happens is that perception and action in the brain converge together. And literally we see association networks in the brain that have this role. They're not feeling the environment directly. They're not directly responsible for moving the body or for making motor plans about moving the body, even long-term ones like I want to go to college in 10 years. Okay? Instead what they are is areas where representations of patterns of actions and plans and patterns of perceptions, including social perceptions, are brought together, they converge to create a representation of a skill. Now that's my thinking on it. I don't know that, I'm just writing this up, so I don't know that other people in cognitive development would agree with me. I don't think they would disagree. Kurt was very excited by it. With the fact that this convergence in the brain, I think, is actually the substrate for skill formation. It's the biological mechanism by which action and perception inform each other into one unit, a modal unit we call skill. But here's the critical piece. In the neurological work that we're currently doing, we're finding that there are actually maybe two qualitatively different systems for the representation of perception and action coming together to converge. And this, I think, has really critical implications, especially for urban education, and I'll get to that in a minute. What we're finding is that rather than perception and action converging in a sort of layered way in which there's sort of a linear increase in complexity as skills get more and more complex, skills including emotions, okay, instead what we're finding is that the convergence of perception and action is divided along two different biological networks. These networks overlap, to be sure, but it's divided along two biological networks. One of these networks seems to relate anatomically as well as neurophysiologically to motor planning and perception and control of what you might call the sort of immediate physical context, immediate or near long term, right? The ways that you act in the environment now, the ways that you feel in those actions, and the flip side of that is the way that you see other people do these things, the way that you behave in a context right now. Okay? Or in the future, but that is sort of related to your immediate kinds of behaviors and skills. And this will become clear when I juxtapose it to the next thing. By contrast, we're finding a separate network, or another network, they overlap, but another network that relates to, rather than musculoskeletal systems and the perception and motoric control of them, and your behaviors and your motor planning for them, it relates instead to an internal somatosensory network that feels the visceral systems. Okay? These two things seem to be functionally subdivided for particular kinds of learning. And that is, when someone engages the visceral internal network, what we see is an activation of the brain areas that are thought to support self-consciousness and self-awareness in the very most basic sense. So these are the same brain areas that are compromised in very late-stage Alzheimer's disease, when you get the sense that grandma just doesn't really know who she is anymore, and she's kind of not just confused and losing memory, but she really has no sense, that sort of subjective sense that I'm a person in the world and I'm experiencing my own life, right, that we all have, and that we really want to cultivate in students. Right? We need students, especially in urban settings where they're at risk. We need them to identify their own sense of self with the context in which they're in, with the people that we want them to emulate. We want them to engage themselves and build an identity for themselves around certain kinds of social interactions and certain kinds of skills, as opposed to other ones. And it looks like engaging networks of the self like that is a separate kind of an endeavor from engaging networks related to the sort of musculoskeletal system and the skills we do with it and the situations that befall it. So I'm going to get to this in detail in a minute, but just to sort of foreshadow what's coming. The experiment that's currently under review goes something like this. We had people into the lab, and they sit with me for 2 hours, and we talked about a series of real stories about real people. Okay? Some of these stories, and they are real, I got them from all over the world, and took a little poetic license in organizing them so that they would fit the pattern of the experiment, but the critical actions are always real. Some of these stories are meant to inspire sort of lower level versions of social emotions. Compassion for somebody else's physical pain, for example. You see someone twist their ankle. How does that make you feel? Okay? And people go, oh, that's awful. Oh, it makes my ankle hurt. You know what I mean? I just think, yuck, okay, this terrible, poor person. Okay? But there's no real deep moral connotation to seeing a sports figure twist an ankle, especially when we make very clear in the experiment that it's not career-ending and it's not long-term and it's all fine. Okay? Or admiration for skill. You see a basket player shoot a fantastic shot, or you see somebody solve a Rubik's Cube blindfolded incredibly quickly, right? And you really think, that's amazing, wow, I wish I could do that. Okay? But it's really not got deep moral implications for your own sense of self or identity. Contrast that with emotions about others' moral situations, their social situations. For example, the equivalent would be compassion for social pain. Someone who knows something about their genetic makeup, that they're going to die of Huntington's disease in 20 years, and they just accidentally became pregnant. Okay? What's going through that person's mind at that time? Right? There's no physical pain there, everything is perfectly comfortable, but you know, and you automatically empathize as an adult, as someone who's experienced things like this, but not this exactly. You automatically feel some of the emotion that they're feeling and the moral implications of that emotion for that person's life. Okay? Or admiration for virtue. Somebody who isn't particularly, you don't see any particular skillful behavior going on, but you know something about the way that person conducts their life, the way that person has been committed to particular goals in the face of terrible obstacles in order to help other people. That fills you with a kind of awe or sort of vicarious happiness for their accomplishments and makes you inspired, makes you want to be more like them, makes you strive to be a better person. And people actually say that in the lab. Hearing about this person's story makes me grateful for my own circumstances or makes me want to be a better person. I want to emulate them. I don't want to do what they did. I don't want to move to a war-torn region in Uganda and save people, but I want to be a useful, good person who helps others to the best of my ability. Okay? This divide turns out to reflect different sets of neurological mechanisms. And, interestingly, this divide seems to reflect a trade-off between external focused attention, which you might call like Posner has discovered and people like that, McCandless, where they talk about kids focusing on, learning to focus on particular skills and practice them in order to automatize them. Okay? Which I'm not saying you don't need some of that in schools, okay, not at all. But what I'm saying is we tend in the current way of thinking, especially at the policy level, to overly emphasize the external focusing of children's attention onto problems that require them to focus, pay attention, don't daydream, Johnny, right? What we're finding neurologically is that there may be a trade-off between these two systems, so that when the externally focused system is activated so that you can focus on an external problem, the internal sense of self and all of the identity that goes with that, all of the sense of moral emotion, deep, complex, ethical decision-making, the kinds of emotions that make you feel like you're inspired to be, in general, a better person, those are suppressed temporarily while you're focusing outward. Now, I hope you're starting to see what some of the implications, the testable implications for this trade-off might be for urban educational settings. And I'm going to kind of go ahead here. But in overly focusing on external networks like that, okay, and I'm not at all saying that you don't need some focus like that, not at all, but especially when we're asking kids to be very, very vigilant, typically in especially dangerous urban settings, where they need to pay attention. Watch where you're going when you walk down the street. Don't daydream, get your head out of the clouds, and focus on what's going on around you. The flip side of that might be that we're diminishing kids' skill in recruiting their sort of internally focused self-network, that same network that rides on their viscera, that it grounds them in the state of their own gut, that sense that you have when like something is just morally repugnant, it almost makes you feel physically ill, right? or that sense you have when you get very bad news, or when you hear bad news about somebody else, that makes you feel like I literally got punched in the stomach, right? It turns out, we're finding, that the neurological substrate for that reaction, that deep sort of moral reaction, that long-term ethical reaction, social reaction, rides on the actual neurobiological substrate for sensing your viscera in a trade-off mechanism with external sensation of your own body. So let me get to the data. So to just come back around, this is a picture of my cute little nephew, right? He's looking at us through a set of mirrors, okay? And I'm using this as a metaphor for the way that we all understand the world from a neurobiological perspective. We don't directly perceive reality. There is no such thing. We are not little video camcorders walking around recording what actually happened to us. What we're doing is interpreting and perceiving reality via mechanisms that allow us to experience social networks, other people's situations on our own selves. That's how we learn from social context. This is sort of follows very closely. It's sort of a neurobiological substrate to the processes that Vygotsky was talking about. He really had it quite right, I think. Now we internalize culture and we internalize ways of understanding by learning from other people in social interactions, and that we do this via the substrate of our own self. But the new insight is that, if it plays out, is that we do this on the substrate of our own self in a differentiated manner that no one has really ever talked about before. We have two kinds of self. They're related, but two kinds of self. One is sort of an externally focused musculoskeletal self, the kind of self that allows us to admire basketball players for the way that they shoot, right? The kind of self that allows us to feel pain in our own knee when we see somebody else's knee get whacked, okay? And another self, that's an internal self, the kind of self that allows us to identify with the gut, visceral kind of reaction that you get when somebody else is in a moral or social dilemma, a complex dilemma that has social implications for them, but not necessarily immediate physical implications for them. If we want to create students who can do things like resist gang membership, right, and identify and be inspired by the teacher, okay, and not just admire at the level of sort of musculoskeletal and cognitive accompanying systems, not just admire basketball players, but also admire Gandhi, I would suggest that we need to actively pay attention to training students in both of these networks, that we teach them to be skillful about recruiting their own sense of self, their own visceral gut sensation, using that as a moral compass, and then trading it off when necessary, when appropriate, to externally focused attention. That we pay attention to training both of these networks. So in terms of like just an immediate hypothesis, something that could be tested, something that could try out on Monday morning in a school, right? We all know that, for example, conflict resolution programs have a lot of variability in their success, right? You take kids that fight with each other, that are real problem kids, so to speak, and you try to teach them what? You try to teach them skills for negotiating social interactions, for empathizing with somebody else, okay? You don't want to hurt people, you don't mug people, you don't hurt people in these ways. Why? Because how would it feel to you, right? And, we have moderate success with that. Maybe one of the reasons we have only moderate success is because these kids, by virtue of the fact that they live in such a media-rich, externally focused environment in which they need to be vigilant, right? Externally focused and vigilant, actually is robbing them doubly. It's training them to focus more on the external kinds of body representations. It's teaching them to admire basketball players and skillful skillful sports figures, more than it's allowing them to develop their own sense of identity around deeper moral issues. Right? So maybe what you do with these kids is, before you start teaching them conflict resolution skills, you start teaching them some kind of skills for recruiting their own visceral self, like meditation or something. Forget conflict resolution. Teach meditation a little bit. And then see, and people are trying this and they're finding it very effective. They don't really know why, but they know that in an intuitive way, that engaging kids' selves in the situation is going to help them to be able to identify with somebody else's situation, right? maybe this is part of the reason. If you teach them to use those networks, and now let's talk about what it means when you hurt somebody else. How does that make them feel on your own self? You've got a much better basis for a high-level, moral, abstract kind of understanding that's visceral, instead of just sort of an immediate, in-the-context action kind of understanding. You look very skeptical. Go ahead.
Well, I'm not skeptical, but we know that delinquents have score very low in empathy. And
Delinquency.
delinquents.
Yes, right.
High in egocentrism, low on empathy. So a lot of the programs are trying to teach empathy in order to change your social behavior. So what I'm saying is neurological research going to confirm what we already know, that psychology, or is it going to inform us in new directions, or both?
Okay, so let me tell you this. That's absolutely the question to ask. And you know, as educators, that is what you must ask, because way too often, especially, I'll go to schools and think, oh, great, just tell us how to teach our kids. I'm like, you know what I mean? Right? But here's the answer. You need to be very discerning. And do you care about particular brain network? Do you care where this self network is that I'm about to show you? You don't give a damn, and you shouldn't. No. You absolutely shouldn't, right? I'm going to show it to you just to prove that I actually have data, and I'm not making this up out of my head. But you really shouldn't care. What you should care about, what you should take away and test, is the hypothesis that the reason that training empathy might be less effective than you would like is because you're training the wrong kind of empathy. You're training empathy for the sort of network that enables musculoskeletal interaction and skill in the moment, instead of training empathy that enables deep social thinking about another person's visceral gut reactions, not their immediate behavior in the moment. Does that make sense? So I hope that's a new insight, right? It might help you to further develop your empathy teaching programs in a way that might or might not be more effective. If it's not more effective, please come back and tell me, and I'll see if we can figure out why and change it. Yeah, but thank you for asking the question.
That's why they pay me the big bucks.
All right. So let me skip ahead. Do you want to see the brain areas? Like I said, you don't need to. You do. Yes. All right, great. I'll show them to you. So the idea is that emotions, especially even complex social emotions, ride on the physiology of the self and the body. Right? When I said before that emotions are a physiological state of the body, surprise, surprise, they're actually represented in the brain on the somatosensory networks, on the same networks that allow you to feel, both your outside musculoskeletal body and your viscera. So I'm just going to show you one brain area that's critical. So this is a brain facing this way. You're seeing it from the side. The eyeballs go in here. And what they've done is cut away some of the cortex that folds over here. And underneath, what you see is this huge piece of cortex. It's kind of, the brain folds over on the side. There's this big crack along it. What you see, if you peel it apart, is a huge piece of real estate. Huge piece of real estate that we're only beginning to understand now. 20 years ago, we really was not known what this thing did. But it's gigantic. Turns out that this area is called the insula, because it's insulated, it's covered underneath. It's called the insula, and it is the platform for somatosensory representation of the gut and the viscera, of your heart rate, of your lungs, of your liver, of your intestines. Right? When you suddenly become aware that you've got a kind of a knot in your stomach from stress, okay? When you're addicted to cigarettes, right? Right? A behavior that changes the state of your viscera through exposing it to nicotine, right? Critical here. You get a lesion here, especially on the right. This is a new science paper that Antonio Damasio and some other colleagues had last spring. You get a lesion here, and in a heavily addicted smoker, and the smoking goes away forever without any withdrawal symptoms, and the person finds smoking disgusting from ever on. Right? It's very, very powerful. What it says is that this is the network, especially the anterior, this is the network on which we learn how behaviors are going to influence our gut and the way we feel in our gut. So, you've got a guess about where I'm going to show you some activation. Right? A couple more areas I want to point out. So these are the insula. The anterior insula is what we're interested in, the anterior, okay? These are the two insula sliced through this way. You got a brain like this. This is the top, this is the back, this is like front, back, and this is the insula sliced through sideways. this you can see, it's a head this way of one of our subjects, okay? The nose, okay? And I want to point out a couple of other areas. The area that I alluded to before, that is critical for self-awareness and self-consciousness. Now, please don't go away saying that Mary Helen showed us the brain area that is yourself, right? Because that's not at all what it is. What it is, though, is a sort of high-level association area or a convergence zone, as they've been called, a high-level association area that brings together your perceptual and motoric experiences and skills with your memory and your learning, especially episodic memory about your own life, brings those together in order to unite them so that you can learn from and interrelate your actions and your plans and your feelings and your skills with your memory and your history. And I would suggest, but this is very new interpretation, I would suggest that the subjective experience of this area of the brain being recruited is what we call the self. It's that results in that subjective sense that you say, I'm a person and I'm real and I'm here and I'm somebody, like I'm living a life. I'm not just an automaton or something. Okay? So some evidence that this part of the brain supports self-awareness in that way. This is called the posteromedial cortices, if you want to know. I just gave a talk about this to a bunch of educators in San Francisco last week at a school, and they all want to know the name after I left. They didn't tell the name. Who cares about the name? But I'll tell you. Okay. Those posteromedial cortices are the area that goes down when you're under general anesthesia. Okay. Their activity is suppressed when you're in slow wave sleep, but not when you're dreaming. Okay. When you lose that sense of self in slow wave sleep, okay, you regain it when you're dreaming. When you're dreaming, you have a sense that you're acting in a dream and doing things. Okay, it comes back online, but it goes down. In late-stage Alzheimer's, it's one of the last areas to be affected by plaques, but when it does, you really get the sense that grandma's not grandma anymore. She doesn't know who she is. She's alive and she's eating and she's living, but she's not her, right? That's this. Okay. Some other areas I want to point out. This is the brainstem, this is the spinal cord. This is the brainstem going down. In here is very, very tightly packed real estate of nuclei that support life regulation in the most basic form. If you have a stroke in here, you die right away. Okay? This is heart rate regulation, blood pressure regulation, body chemistry regulation. This is the thing that makes you breathe when you're asleep or unconscious. This stuff in here is critical for controlling basic homeostatic mechanisms and literally just keeping you alive. It's not cognitive, it's not anything complex. It's the machinery that keeps you alive. Yes, sir?
Do we share some of this, the brainstem and the insula, with our friend the ant?
Ah, such a good question. No. Yeah, which is one of the reasons Kurt doesn't like the ant example. Nonetheless, I think it's effective in some ways. But yeah, ants have a very different kind of nervous system from ours. The basic idea that we have sensation and that you change your action according to it is there, but the way that the ganglia come together is not anywhere near as exquisitely tuned and complex as it is in a human. Right? But do we share some of this with dogs or rats? Yeah, more. Mammals begin to develop these kinds of complex interactions, and by the time you get to people, you get by far the most complex in a relationship. Yes?
Yeah, I have a question. You know, if we're talking about keeping kids, helping them build their identity, and talking about if you transfer that to school now, this is a little simplified, but it's also working on some assumptions.
Right.
But if you have kids with learning differences, one of the things we try to do is teach them about their learning differences so they can understand them and be focused on how to accommodate.
Right.
But if they're focused outside on how to accommodate, then are you saying that the price they pay is they're focused externally and they're not building their internal identity?
It's a good question. Well, first I would say that when you teach them about their learning disability, you're not only teaching them facts about it, that they need to sort of focus externally. When you're teaching them, sure, they're focusing on you. They're talking with you. But later, they might become sort of more aware. In fact, part of the teaching might be to teach them to become aware of other kinds of thinking that they do that are characteristic of them as an individual and that reveal particular skills that they can capitalize on. I wrote about this some with my dissertation study. I'm sorry?
Like the Mel Levine stuff about teaching kids to kind of help themselves.
Right, right. part of helping themselves is actually daydreaming and turning inward and reflecting on the state of their own self. That's what I would say. Yeah. So you want them to move between these. I'm not at all suggesting that this is the only network you want kids to have. That would be a disaster. You'd have Johnny daydreaming in the corner all day, right? But what you want is a kid who can skillfully move between these. Okay, so any other places I want to point out to you? Yeah, so this is consciousness. Over here is a part called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus controls our blood chemistry, the hormone levels, and things like that. And what happens when people are in states of deep social compassion or deep admiration for virtue, inspiration from another person's virtuosity? Okay? These are a map of the brain networks that were activated more. The orange is activated more for social narratives about people who were extraordinarily inspiring or who inspired social compassion than for stories about people that were really interesting and engaging and nice stories, but they're not really moving in the same way. Okay? So what you get is this activation of the sort of self network, which is extremely interesting. We're writing the whole focus of the paper that we submitted is on the differential activation here. You get hypothalamus and you get brainstem nuclei. You get the actual nuclei in the brainstem that regulate your most basic life functions when you admire someone else and are in a strong state of inspiration for that person. And they actually tell us by butt presses that they feel this way. This isn't just sort of a disembodied kind of a cognitive evaluation of how great somebody is and you try to be like them. You actually engage your body and your viscera and your heart rate and change your blood chemistry when you feel this way about somebody. We need kids in schools who can engage this kind of network in order to use it as a means for moral decision making and compassion about other people's situations. Yes?
What happens if the opposite? If there's someone in fear?
Oh, fear, yes.
Same areas light up?
No. Fear is a very different kind of emotion, and it's not necessarily a social emotion. You can feel fear of falling off a cliff or something like that. Fear is very primal. Fear is probably the most automatic, quick-acting emotion, and it doesn't usually involve complex sense of self when it's actually invoked. You can have complex senses of fear. Fear for what we're doing to the environment, right? Very long-range, sort of morally tinged fear. Our lifestyles are going to lead to our ultimate demise if we keep driving SUVs, right? Something like that. But when you actually move from the moral aspects of the situation to that gut-level visceral fear, you get a different set of brain activations. Yeah, it's a very good question. Okay, so let me just point out that this is moral emotions. When people were feeling sort of emotions about other, like, I'm really admiring this basketball player's skill. I think that's amazing, so cool, okay? Or this 10-year-old who can play Rachmaninoff on the piano, or this woman who can solve a Rubik's Cube blindfolded, right? What we get is a very different sense of self. We get this area lighting up. This area is just a little bit forward. It's not related to self-awareness in the same way. It's a different kind of self-awareness. It's self-awareness that's interrelated with lateral parietal regions, the regions that control our body and in space and in time. The regions that help us to move and engage the skills that we need at that time to be able to act effectively. It's a very different kind of self. This area is also not nearly as heavily interconnected with the gut or the viscera. This area is heavily interconnected with the gut or the viscera. So it's like we're moving between these two areas with all of their associated networks. One being visceral, internal, and sort of resulting in this subjective sense of self as a moral person who wants to do things, who's grateful for their own good circumstances. And the other being a kind of self that admires skills, that wants to act effectively and efficiently in the immediate or long-term context, but not thinking about the deep moral or social implications of the behavior.
I'm curious how the conscious, unconscious dimension you mentioned at the beginning of your talk
yes.
sort of plays in this.
Yes, it does. It's very, very interesting. Yeah, consciousness is a very tricky is a very tricky concept, but it's a critical one. A lot of what goes on here, a lot of the triggering that goes on here, the calling up of memories that people experience in order to get into these social states, for the woman who finds out she's got Huntington's disease, for example, or the genes that will produce it in 20 years, a lot of that is not conscious. You don't stop and think about every time you've gotten really bad news or what it would be like. And yet, it's the convergence of those memories that allows you to sort of access them in a conscious way. So you could begin to think about, oh, this is how I felt at my grandfather's funeral, or this is how I, right? So the consciousness, these memories kind of come in and out of consciousness, and you can become more or less skilled at calling them into consciousness and calling relevant ones into consciousness. But you're absolutely right to bring consciousness into this because consciousness and emotion are intertwined. They're really two aspects of the same process. In engaging in this kind of emotion, you engage the process of self-consciousness. You bring these things onto the conscious table so that you can reflect on them.
Does a different part of the brain light up when you're doing that?
When you're conscious as to when you're not? There are certain networks of the brain that are thought to be associated with high-level thinking that is conscious. But overall, the networks are hugely overlapping. They're really the same. I think it would be very difficult to have activation here when you're not conscious of what you're thinking about. Yeah, this signals that they must be conscious, but you don't have to have a high level of this to be conscious. You're conscious when you're doing externally focused tasks, but you know that you're subjectively, when you do such a task, you're not thinking about how your left toe feels right then, right? You're not really thinking about how your stomach is or whether you're hungry. You're focusing on doing your thing. So yourself, it's a relative problem. It's like a give and a take, like a seesaw. Does that make sense? Yes?
Are any of these areas connected with the areas that we associate with long-term memory?
Yes, absolutely. That's what I was just referring to when I said that this area is acting like a high-level association or convergence zone by which we access our episodic memories that are relevant and bring them together so that we can understand the social implications for somebody else. We have to have learned about certain kinds of social situations. We have to have experienced certain kinds of emotions in order to be able to empathize with them and other people. Yeah. Yes?
We, three of us, teach in marriage and family therapy program. One of the things that we were thinking about in terms of these applications would be, in our 500 class, we try to teach basic counseling skills.
Yeah.
Mainly empathy.
Right.
In many ways.
Yes.
So what you're saying is if we want to develop empathy as part of their professional identity,
yes,
we should do something that would trigger this, mainly, we were thinking showing a video of someone not being listened to, or someone being given advice, or someone being misunderstood, so that will trigger memories for them of what that felt
That's
like.
a great idea.
And then move forward in trying to train them how to not do
Yes.
that, or how to
Yes.
be more empathetic.
So really, to get back to what you were saying before, it's like, the idea of making learning meaningful to people by tying it into their own personal life and experiences is really not new. But this gives us a new dimension on which to tie into that meaning or that episodic memory. It's a new hook. It's a new differentiation between the different ways that we recruit those kinds of memories and the different ways that we process those memories on our own body.
We have the room till 1:30, so we'll go till
Yeah.
1:30, but I know some
I'm
people
just
have to leave.
summing up with the last couple slides. We can skip them, or we can go if we need to
No,
go.
just keep
What do we
going,
need to
keep
do? All right. So these are just some summary statements, but in other words, learning in the complex sense that we see it in the world or in the schools is not rational or disembodied. It's tied into your body, and it's two sides of the same coin with emotion. The two things flop back and forth. They're two aspects of the same process. And it's not lonely. Even if you're by yourself, it's a social process. You're internalizing the actions and the feelings and the social situations of other people, and you're playing those out on your own self. That's sort of the fundamental. That's the fundamental building block of culture. And so, from the perspective of affective and social neuroscience, the purpose of education then is to increase children's abilities to recognize the complexities of other situations. That means both their physical situations, their skill, and their physical pain, and other kinds of more immediate situations that they're in, and their social and internal and moral dimensions of their situation, and then help them to develop nuanced ways to react to these things by playing them out on their own self. And the morals of the story are that emotion allows us to use our knowledge, in ways that are culturally appropriate and useful. It allows us to internalize things and evaluate them, to play them out as they would feel on our own self. And you get this by now, but they're not sort of add-ons that interfere with thinking. Get the emotion out of the way so that you can think straight is really completely wrong in this kind of a view. Right? Getting certain kinds of emotions under control so that you can focus the emotions that are relevant to this situation, absolutely. But it's not like you're suppressing your emotion to be able to do good cognitive thinking. And emotions involve fundamentally the self and the body, and therefore so should schools. And further differentiation of this is that there may be sort of two aspects of the way that self and body are involved in learning in schools, and that we might be able to get more leverage into teaching identity development and empathy and peer relationships and allowing kids to become inspired by their teachers and to build the right kinds of social networks by recognizing this functional separation and training each part of it explicitly. So, thank you. Yeah. I can take more. Yes.
Mary Ellen, as you probably know, there's a whole industry of consultants, speakers, writing, books, workshops, tapes on brain psychology. Most of these people have not had any neurological training, but there's a lot of information out. I guess some are myths, some are truths. Has anyone analyzed your knowledge, some of these textbooks, some of the basic, quote, truths that are being given to teachers about brain research? Which I have a sense that
Yes.
some of the stuff is...
It's complete bunk.
It is.
It's absolutely bunk. Most
Okay.
of it, right?
Okay.
Most of it's bunk. It falls into one of two categories.
Yeah.
Not bunk, but your grandmother could have told you this, you absolutely don't need neuroscience to do this, right?
Right.
Or bunk,
Right.
right?
Right.
And yes, people are writing
That's a good
articles.
article. That I think the educational enterprise could use a critical analysis
Yeah.
of what's being out there. I mean, people are spending money, teachers
Yeah.
are going to workshops in the belief that they're going to be better teachers if they listen to this advice.
Right.
And I think that's a major problem.
Yes, I work hard with teachers to
Mhm.
overcome those things.
Mhm.
You know, I spend a lot of my time actually in schools working with teachers and at conferences for educators where I try to lay out this stuff.
Right.
And there are some papers that do that. I've also written some that I can show you.
Okay.
Yeah. Usha Goswami is somebody in England. You might want to read her stuff. I can send you the papers.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
I like to stay at the high level where Myron operates there. We're in terms of the research paradigm, where is this your research? Is it a correlational level? Is it strongly correlational? We're just beginning mildly correlational issues. We're not in causality here in neuroscience at this point, are we?
No,
or
we're
what?
looking at
It's
associations.
like illuminating the black box of behaviorism,
Right.
if you will.
Right. We're picking out, we're cleaving open the black box by, it's a great question, because it's important not to draw inferences across levels of analysis, right? Yeah, what we're doing here, the neurological tools are really correlational at this level. We induce these states in people, we interview them about these states, we try to get a sense of how they're actually feeling and how they subjectively experience that. Then we put them in the scanner, we ask them to get into these states, we ask them to tell us whether they're in the states, and then we assume that the changes in the blood flow in their brain reflect something about the neural substrates of these states. And we try to learn from that, not by looking at particular regions that are activated or not activated, but by patterns and networks of regions and what we know from other kinds of neurological data about how those regions function and what happens when they're damaged and things like that. So it's a correlational science at this point, but it's also sort of a model building science where we're trying to use the data to constrain theories at the cognitive level, at the psychological level. Does that answer your question?
Oh,
Yeah.
Can I
Yes.
ask, kind of following on from that? I mean, implied in several things you said are a couple of ideas. One is that somehow having both networks active is quote unquote a good thing, or that there is in some kind of people who we might think of as having positive outcomes or being well adjusted or whatever language you might want, you would see the ability to use both networks. Now, you didn't say that, but there's kind
That's
of this
right.
implicit
In what we would call an educated adult, someone who can
Right.
make good
Okay.
ethical and moral decisions, who knows when the emotional sort of information is relevant and when they're being manipulated, when something is likely to have implications for other people, and how to move between those kinds of thinking. That's right.
So there is kind of a hypothesis there that if you took, and this is really extrapolating, but you took a sample of urban school kids and a sample of suburban private school kids, right? And you could monitor continuously their brain function, you would see a lot more switching back and forth between the two networks in the quote-unquote suburban kids, and in the urban kids you would see some deficient use of the visceral network.
I'm sure there's plenty of suburban kids who would fall into that second camp, absolutely. Having worked in a lot of suburban private schools teaching these things, yeah, very much so. In fact, I have a paper I could send you on this from a colleague of mine who's a longtime educator. He's a head of school who's just recently retired, and in a very prestigious private school, several private schools he's run over his lifetime, writing about students' sense of self in the classroom and where it goes, and how engaging students' sense of self changes their ability to think abstractly about concepts. So it's really an issue facing all schools. And the reason is because also in this media-rich context where especially even the suburban kids are very much externally focused and driven by iPods and all this stuff going on, we don't know, we have no idea what the effect of that is on their ability to internalize. But I'm speculating that if they're focusing outwardly on music and on television programs and doing stuff all the time, that they're not having time to daydream and play out these things on their sense of self. There's actually evidence, believe it or not, from rats that idle time when you're sort of, it needs to be tested with kids, of course, but in rats, they find that they see the same patterns of activation, of spiking of neurons recorded from the hippocampus, which is a part that's consolidating long-term memory, when they've been learning something new, in this case a maze, when they're learning the maze, when they're actually in the act of learning it, and later when they're sitting quietly licking their paws. All of a sudden these patterns start reoccurring. And it's like they're just spacing out, licking their paws, and replaying the thing as a way to consolidate it. If you don't have time to do that, if that's discouraged, you know? Replaying!
Now when I go like this.
Are you saying
Science.
that the two centers are similar to parasympathetic and sympathetic, and one is activated, the other one is inhibited?
The relationship to parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system is another open question that we are studying. We just got a new postdoc who's working on that. It's becoming clear that parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems do not trade off necessarily with each other. You can have both activated or both deactivated, and the relationship between them is a much more intricate and dynamic balance than was ever thought before. But it will relate to this. Give us a few years.
Well, I guess what I was using that as more of a metaphor, but are they mutually exclusive? When one is activated, is the other inhibited?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Oh, do you mean of these two networks?
Yeah.
Oh, yes, it appears that way. That's right. It appears, and you know subjectively you probably experience it that way. When you're focusing on an external problem, when you're writing something, you're excited about it, and you're engaged, even if you hate it, even if you're writing a letter about, to your spouse you're about to divorce, okay? It's not about being happy, right? And educators often think it's about positive affect, it's not, right? It's about strong affect, whichever way. But when you're writing and you're really focusing on something, you suddenly realize, oh, I'm hungry, right? It doesn't build up slowly. It suddenly percolates into consciousness that the whole time this visceral response of your stomach's been going on, right? You shift that down, you tone it down, you don't bring it into consciousness while your consciousness is focused outward. So it does seem to be a trade-off. There were a whole bunch of questions. Yes, go ahead.
What connection do you see, if at all, or if you've even thought about it, between these kinds of states and the state of flow?
Yeah, like Csikszentmihalyi described.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. It's a very interesting question. Whether flow, there might be one of the reasons that flow has been hard to tap is that in different domains and in different people's with different preferences, they actually engage two kinds of flow. That it might be that there's a kind of flow that I was just talking about when you're writing and you're focused and you're not paying attention to the outside world. You're focused on you're focusing on one thing, as opposed to a different kind of flow that is internal, that in which you're sort of dreaming up creative ties between episodic memories and feelings and emotions and actions and skills that will enable you to produce something later. So it might be. I'm completely speculating. I don't know. This is a brand new idea that that no one has said yet, and I'm just trying it out on you guys, and then I'll write it and see how it gets treated. But yeah, it's a great hypothesis that it might have implications for something like that, and for creativity, for the role of culture in shaping identity and self. Yeah. Yes?
I just wonder about the whole, you mentioned iPods and things, about the whole MySpace and Facebook generation. It looks like, you know, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's the internal network seems to be sort of like journal writing, reflection, whereas my Facebook seems to be the current version of journal writing, but it's also looking inside and constantly presenting it to external. So is that at all?
That's a great question. The answer is we don't know. But my thinking on it is that you're absolutely right to think that it's not just about the modality. It's not about whether you're doing it on a computer or you're doing it on a web page or you're using MySpace or an iPod or you're not using MySpace or an iPod. It's about how you engage with those kinds of sort of reflective mechanisms and the goal that you have in doing so. So it might be very well that for a lot of kids, MySpace is an excellent outlet for turning their attention inward. Or it might be the opposite, that they're really making social alliances at a very superficial level, or not a superficial level, but a more musculoskeletal kind of a level, thinking in neurobiological terms, and that they're not getting. So it's either way. It depends on how that individual child is interacting. Same with it. Same thing with music, right? It could be that for some people, certain kinds of music helps them to tune out external, distractions so that they can turn inward. I'm not saying that listening to music is bad. I'm just saying that we need to be very mindful about the ways that people engage with these kinds of technologies and the role that they're playing in their development, especially when they're spending a lot of time doing it.
I'd like to thank Mary Helen for
Oh, thank you for listening. It was
fascinating
great.
talk. Really great. Thank you.